It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussel, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussel in Carmel, California. This is tape or broadcast number 480, and it's February 15th, 1981. I want to apologize to the subscribers and other listeners for last week. The power went off. There was a description in the Monterey Herald. The next day, electricity in Lower Carmel Valley and Carmel Highlands was knocked out Sunday evening. 903 customers suffered a power outage for 6 minutes, but 15 others had a power outage until the next morning. KLRB was one of the 15 that had the electricity out until the next morning. They blamed the outage on a malfunctioning transformer in an underground vault, and so it goes. I've never been in a circumstance like this where I had to cancel the tapes, and I was up till 3 or 4 in the morning writing to subscribers and apologizing. But I didn't want to put the program on another time during the week and lose the continuity with the listeners who are used to having the program on Sunday night. And I had a very important story I wanted to get started with all of you, the regular listeners in the local area and in Santa Cruz, Salinas, and Monterey Peninsula, as well as the subscribers. And I'm going to stick with that one story and its tangling alliances. It's complicated enough tonight. And there are other stories in the news that I'm going to put off, as important as they are, until probably next week. I'll just mention them briefly because you'll wonder if I'm getting the stories or not. One is the Soviet replies to Haig and his attacks of them on terrorism, and they're accusing the United States of political assassinations in the United States and killing Aldo Moro in Italy, and retaliating with charges of American assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and others. I want to talk about the Newhouse Un-American activities and the escalation of suppression at home. Johnny Meyer in Canada, I mentioned a few weeks ago, had charges that the CIA took over the Hughes organizations and that Howard Hughes was not buried in Texas. And this week, the Beverly Hills police charged him with a murder charge of Alfred Wayne Netter in Beverly Hills. It happened in 1974. Johnny Meyer called me. He knows he was framed, and he's panicky about the Hughes people will do. They'll either kill him or lock him up. I said, write a 10 or 20-page story like the Gemstone Files, which came out of my house originally, Bruce Roberts' Gemstone story. Give the worst charges of the CIA, of what they did, how they kidnapped Howard, how they killed him, how they killed Robert Kennedy, everything that you know about the LAPD and the intelligence community, and you send it to me, and I will mimeograph 20 sheets and ask people to receive them to mimeograph 20, and we will cover the United States and get subscribers to receive these and send them to the Associated Press, United Press, Time, Newsweek, and so forth. So Johnny Meyer, finally, he's worked with the Hughes people 10 years. He says he's had enough, and maybe some of the stories that I have been telling you about the past 9 years will come through when he gets this typed up and we get going with that. I want to talk about the USSR answer to United States charges of expansion. That's different than the terrorism, and the flight of 70 top Russian military officials that were killed this last week and buried already. That's a very big story with strong international implications. We could be on the verge of the war right now if Haig and his gang and Casey planned that plane sabotage, or it has other implications that I want to go into. It was secreted for days. The men are already buried with top officials of the Soviet military, 70 of them. I want to talk about the Lincoln Brigade. It was the anniversary of their reunion and the significance of the Lincoln Brigade and the first freedom fighters that went out to fight Hitler and Mussolini in Spain and fight Franco. And I want to talk a little bit about them and compare the kind of work that I'm doing and some of you researchers are doing. Although we haven't put our lives on the line yet, the time will come, and these men alerted us long ago. I spent the last 3 weeks reading David Lifton's Best Evidence. I read it for 1 week, 700 pages. I outlined it. Another week, And I'll be talking about that controversial book on the Kennedy assassination. There's legislation in Sacramento to outlaw the Klan and the Nazi Party. This may be the only chance, if this is turned down, for the United States to stop them. I want to talk about the Alpha 66, the assassination teams, and Bill Moyer's movie on the CIA secret army and how they're a rogue elephant out of control now with their ability to bomb and kill, and where they're going from there. New information on the Lindbergh case that just came from the National Archives. I've talked about the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby and Bruno Hauptmann being framed. New information in the news the past few weeks on that. They're kamikaze troops, 25,000 of them in Africa, in a country, Malawi, M-A-L-A-W-I, and if you don't know it, it's right on your map of Africa. Look it out. They have now 25,000 kamikaze, and South Africa has offered them atomic bombs, and there's a threat to kill black Africans with the atomic bomb in this country. That would be cute because whatever is left, South Africa would have a better chance of controlling. They're offering them atomic bombs. The Nazi and the Klans are together in Riverside, California. Articles coming out of there. And one of the Nazis there at this present time is Thane Caesar, the man who shot and killed Robert Kennedy from the back of the head, who's living in Riverside, working with the Nazi Party, never put in jail. And the consequence of not stopping these assassinations is that these people continue with these far-right assassination teams in the boonies, such as Riverside, California. I want to talk about Bill Haley, the musician who died in Texas, one of the fathers of rock and roll. He was still young when he was found dead. The moral majority has come out for the death penalty of homosexuals this week, and 2 days after they did that, there was the Hilton fire in Las Vegas where they blamed a homosexual with a smirk on his face who smokes marijuana and reads nonfiction books. His buddies have gotten away, and the fire was started in a lot of other places, but this came right after the announcement of the intention of the death penalty for the homosexuals. There are some important murders in the Bay Area. University of California in San Francisco, the dean of pharmacy at UC Medical School, Dr. Jorgensen, was murdered today. It was in the paper, in a cyanide poisoning at Stanford. Franz Sondenheimer, a chemist teaching at Stanford University, who fell over in the lab and died of cyanide poisoning. And the death of David Wilson, a drug enforcement agent who had links to both Stanford and San Francisco Medical School, who worked in the Marines he was with Nixon's drug enforcement agency. He was in Milan. He called home that he just caught one of the big drug dealers from Iran, and he had one of those famous diseases, their apparent heart attacks, a young man, and he died, the common denominator. The Bay Area again, and there are quite a few deaths taking place. There was a reign of terror in the home of Richard Burke, the aide to Senator Ted Kennedy, that smacks of danger and includes a note that they're going to kill Ronald Reagan's son. I'm sure that's the one, the ballet dancer. The Secret Service is on that case. New information on the Lennon killing and Mark David Chapman. And next week I will get to the Philip Thompson case in San Francisco. Philip Thompson, John Abbott, and Michael Hennessy, and the murder of a woman who, I believe that case is directly linked to what I'm going to talk about tonight. I think they'll all fit together, so I'm going to put that off till next week. That is the group called, in quotes, the headquarters of International Crime Conglomerate, up in San Francisco with links to Vancouver and to El Salvador, to the right-wing group, and Bolivia and Colombia. Drugs, Nazis, far right, involving prison guards supplying the weapons. I mentioned it briefly several weeks ago. And then next week I'll talk about Dewey D. from the Philippines, described as the Philippine Rockefeller, or Robert Vesco, who took $70 million out of the banks in the Philippines in case the government collapses. The Marcos and the crime syndicate are taking their cash out of the Philippines. And I'll talk about Michael Sindona and that helicopter almost escaped from the federal prison in New York, and the links to the attorney for David Chapman, Mark David Chapman, Lennon's killer, and to the intelligence and police gang, strong links to that. Those are a lot of stories, and I'm not going to touch any one of them. Would be an hour discussion to cover it thoroughly, but I mention them because they're in the news, and I had a lot of conflicts of whether to bring some of those in tonight, but we're going to put all of that off until future dates, a lot of them hopefully next week. What I want to talk about tonight is what it could possibly have all the earmarks of the Reagan Gate. They call this the zero factor, where the president gets shot, ending this, in this time period, the one elected in 1980. I think that there's another way to slip the rug out of that old man and let Mr. Bush be president and maybe Haig be vice president. And I think that Reagan is very vulnerable, and there are some rumblings here of the beginning of Reagan Gate, and I want to go over them with you as closely as I can. I began to follow missing money, just a few years ago when I was reading the history of the end of World War I, when Herbert Hoover took $50 million from Congress to feed the poor, and it was actually going into an army, the Solidaris and the Vaslov's army, that would make war against the Soviet Union and arm Hitler. Our tax dollars were put to that purpose, so that millions of dollars through subterfuge was funding armies. And then I mentioned before the burglary in Nice, France in 1977 of $10 million, where Albert Spaglieri said it was for Nazi fascist purposes, and he was in the police department and he left. And they're Paris thieves. Recently, I mentioned November 1980 that got $12 million and emptied vaults and just left with this $12 million saying thank you. And they wrote on the wall, "Without hate, arms, and violence." And I've mentioned other big, large accounts of money that are missing. 140 million of Mr. Eli Pincus, and he and his wife died simultaneously, one in Monte Carlo and Cannes, France, this last October, and he died in Switzerland, and they had died of cyanide, the same thing that this professor at Stanford just died from this week. And I mentioned the Nugan Hand affair. I'm going to go back to that this evening. $50 million that was missing out of Australia. It was a CIA bank set up by the CIA that had to do with heroin traffic and CIA funding for agents in Australia. And it was linked to John Paisley and the Kennedy assassination. Paisley had links to Lee Harvey Oswald and the Soviet Union through the National Security Council. But very many people involved with this Nugan Hand Bank died in the last year. So that many times on this program I talk about floating money, and in conjunction with that I mentioned a small amount of money that was taken out of the Wells Fargo Bank in Beverly Hills recently. First it started as a little story, $2.3 million, and then it became $21 million, and the amount kept going up until now it may be $200 or $300 million. And the story just escalated in proportions, and where the money could be going is what I think is important about it. Now, I'm going to tell you some of the characters involved in this script and then go through the details of them so you get an idea of how broad it is. In the first of all place, the FBI is into this case now because of the bank robbery, the money missing, and international implications. And the FBI is investigating non-boxing figures. It all started with a Muhammad Ali sports group. That was the name of a group that allegedly took this money for boxers. And now the FBI has said, we're looking into figures other than boxers, but they didn't say who. They're looking into organizations other than boxing, but the FBI as yet haven't said who. The money that is involved here involves money that came in from Australia, and the Harold Smith, who's the main lead character of this story, was making trips from Switzerland back and forth to Australia and then to Hong Kong. Those are the same areas that we're putting money into. The Nugan Hand Bank was in Australia. The locale for the operations, or the heart of it, seems to be the Beverly Hills Bank, the Wells Fargo Bank of Beverly Hills, even though it involves many branches of the Wells Fargo Bank, and the interesting part is the San Francisco banks, because of so much international gun running, narcotics traffic linked to the CIA and the FBI, as examples the SLA story and the Jonestown story, and the one that I mentioned, these characters that I'm going to be probably doing next week that escalated with the murder of a woman. Her name is Miss McDonald. This story involves Madison Square Garden, links to Madison Square Garden, that is controlled by Gulf and Western, and that was the conduit of the CIA money that went in to creep the committee to re-elect the president, Maurice Stans, the Gemstone Files, the secret millions of dollars to alter the election or the assurance of the election of Richard Nixon, the conduit of Gulf and Western, and they own Madison Square Garden. And this case involves Madison Square Garden. It involves international narcotic money, which I'm sure will link up. There's nobody who has more expertise into the narcotics and the international than Robert Vesco, who's very closely associated, not with Billy Carter, but with the entire Howard Hughes organization, the Ronald Reagan organization, and that gang. It involves Las Vegas and Caesar's Palace, and last week Frank Sinatra just got his permit to get involved in the casino at Caesar's Palace. It involves an attorney by the name of Paul Caruso. The lead character in this story, Mr. Harold Smith, is missing now. He says that you can see why as we go into the story. They're trying to kill him. He expects that he'll be killed, but he's holding documents that are very important to the scandalous pilfering of the Wells Fargo banks and the branches and the branch managers for the last 8 or 9 years. That is $300 million. And all of a sudden they tried to pin him for the $21 million. Now, I think that $300 million could be the conduit of espionage money in California, and that Smith probably is telling the truth. And he has threatened to tell everything, and that he's holding documents that this is going on through these branches of the Wells Fargo Bank in Santa Monica, the Miracle Mile, and up through the state. And he says he'll tell everything, and he called for his attorney, Paul Caruso. Well, I know that the Manson family was under the direction of the FBI and the CIA. It was a COINTEL operation for many reasons that I studied. And last week, Peter Pitchess, the sheriff who was in charge of the Manson operation at the Spahn Ranch, which was run by the Hughes organization, Peter Pitchess testified for Frank Sinatra at Caesar's Palace, saying if Sinatra is involved in the mob, then I'm the godfather. And it's a complicated web, but Paul Caruso sat with Sue Atkins when she broke the story of the Manson family. Along with her was Lawrence Schiller, who also was linked to great confessions at the time of the Lenny Bruce case, Marilyn Monroe, Jack Ruby. The same cast of characters runs through these dramas. So that this Harold Smith is saying, I have documents to prove what's going on at these banks, and that we're just sucked in. We're little minnows. He isn't saying he's innocent, but he said we're minnows. And Paul Caruso of the Manson family will be his attorney if and when he surfaces. As I say, Sinatra this week was just testifying about getting his position at Caesar's Palace, and this also involves Caesar's Palace in Vegas and then on to the New Jersey tables. The chairman of Madison Square Garden that has been brought into this case, he was at Ronald Reagan's birthday party this week. He was the public relations man that got Reagan started on his career, and he's close to Reagan, and Madison Square Garden ties into this. Ronald Reagan announced this week that he's going to take his first presidential trip, and you think it would be Paris or London or some world center, Brazil or whatever. He's taking Air Force One to Tijuana. And I think that this story has the seeds of Reagan-gate, and I think he's going to go to Tijuana for very important reasons. Not to Mexico to see the president of Mexico. He just saw him. I think his trip to Tijuana, if he goes there, is linked directly to what happened to the Wells Fargo banks and where the money went. And is it linked to him and his buddies and the Vegas gang and Paul Laxalt, because this goes right to Vegas, and Paul Laxalt, the senator from Vegas, was the governor of Las Vegas, and he's the liaison of Congress to Ronald Reagan. I still want to call him Nixon. So you have, and federal money that went into an operation, the federal U.S. government money that went in to an operation in Pasadena that brought Harold Smith into the operation. And then, last but not least, there's Dan Rather of the Eastern Seaboard breaking this story and nudging it on. He seemed to be the one that got it off the ground, and Dan Rather has his finger in it, which would be appropriate for the people on the East Coast, the Council of Foreign Relations and the Trilateral and the George Bush gang to begin to push Ronnie out or aside and to begin to peel off layers of the crime syndicate and the mob that have surrounded Reagan all of his life. It was a very good cover story that he made to be president of the United States, but the real backgrounds have the connections of him, or even properly exposed of Nixon before him, have never been put out on the table. Now, the FBI had some conclusions about this investigation. They were in the Village Voice in January 14th of this year, and they said, just one part of an article said, coming out of Beverly Hills, out of the Wells Fargo Bank, are unknown sources of money thought to be cocaine and drugs. The FBI is investigating television networks that broadcast fights, Las Vegas casinos that bankroll boxing. They're going to investigate corporate power, monopolies, skimming, extortion, conspiracy, bribery, mail fraud, and tax evasion. Now, the FBI does all of that. They'll be busy for quite a few years, but there are many tentacles to this story, and they're important to follow. Well, who is Mr. Harold Smith? Let's go into, now that I've told you the conclusions or some of the tentacles, we'll talk about Harold Smith. He's a guy that didn't have any money to speak of in 1977, 78. He dropped a bombshell that was printed in the Los Angeles Times on February the 4th. He's been charged with taking embezzlement $21 million out of the Wells Fargo Bank, and he said the real amount, as I said before, is $200 to $300 million. He said, I just came back from Switzerland. This is from the Los Angeles Times. He reminds me of William Taub. I've done stories about him, how he went to Europe and his life was in danger, and he came back and wrote a book and spilled the beans of some of the scandals he was involved in. They run to Switzerland fast, probably, and leave copies of their diaries or their documents that become their life insurance so they won't be killed. And maybe the investigation will be halted or shut. He said, I just got back from Switzerland. We never did get the $21 million I'm charged with, and we're not talking about $21 million. He said this is going to reach at least 15 different bank managers, 20 different Wells Fargo banks throughout California. And once I do what I am going to do, and I know they're out to try and stop me because they tried to kill me, he said, and my family before I left, this thing involves bank officials going 8 or 9 years, going back 8 or 9 years. We were used as pigeons. Once the public is aware of these documents, and I'm going to turn the documents over, I can foresee a run of Wells Fargo banks of people getting their money out of these banks like you've never seen in the history of banking. The alleged fraud was accomplished through an international manipulation of funds. I don't know what documents he has. He backed up his allegations. He said, why don't you start with the Wilshire Miracle Mile manager, Gene Kawakami, and Wells Fargo Bank denied that he had any involvement. Then they quickly dismissed Kawakami. Smith said, why don't you start with the bank manager in Beverly Hills? That's a place to start. If he's been telephoning various people, news media people in Los Angeles and the New York Times. I'm going to talk about the way the press has been handling this story, too. The New York Times just loves it. They have 2 pages back-to-back, full pages. It started in the sports section, or page 9, 2 million missing, and so forth. And it's building itself up to the second and third pages of some newspapers that I'm taking, and other papers aren't carrying it all. Smith said, start with the Beverly Hills Bank, the bank manager, for a start. It is there that you will find the beginning of what I guarantee is one of the biggest cases of fraud and embezzlement involving numerous branches and personnel within the Wells Fargo system. Now, if it was just money that was being embezzled for certain purposes, it would be an interesting story, because I do like to watch where this money floats if you can follow it. But money such as the Nugan Hand Bank, that was all CIA money that goes to pay off certain agents or to kill other people who know too much. The interest I have in this Wells Fargo story is because there's been so much counterintelligence in the state of California and so much confusion about where money is coming from and how these people operate, that create things like the SLA is the CIA that takes a lot of money. So Smith is charging that go to the bank managers, and that's where you'll get your first lead. Now, where will the scandal go? He says it will go from Wilshire Boulevard to Wells Fargo Bank in San Francisco, branches and officers and bank personnel in San Francisco. And there, as I said, there's so much counterintelligence in San Francisco, and my concern about certain agents such as Charles Bates of the FBI, who was in Chicago when Fred Hampton was killed as part of the COINTEL program, who's sitting there waiting to pounce. He works for a TV station and for movies, and he's on salary with the news media, and he sat at the house of Randolph Hearst and kept all information about who really had kidnapped Patty Hearst and the links of Donald DeFreeze to the Los Angeles Police Department and so forth. He intercepted every message and stood at the doorway of Randolph Hearst's home and diverted real stories and kept up this false looking for Patty when they knew where she was. And people like Charles Bates are really working on somewhat of a non-salary, and I've predicted that San Francisco would have a whole series of violences. So if this money is up in San Francisco banks, it could be used for these kinds of purposes. What does the Wells Fargo Bank say? They say it's ridiculous, that they don't acknowledge that any more than $21 million was taken. The bank says the allegation is absurd. That's one of the quotations in the paper. At the same time, according to the New York Times, the Wells Fargo Bank has had the FBI in to examine their books. They're looking at the financing of their books. 2 aircraft allegedly owned by the organization that was supposed to have taken the $21 million, the Muhammad Ali, the promotion fight group, took 2 airplanes. The FBI says they're not the subject of an FBI search. They don't want the airplanes. The New York Times says, in quotes, the magnitude of the alleged fraud has stunned the California banking community. There is speculation that Wells Fargo's computers have been systematically manipulated for perhaps a year or more. The computers. On the other hand, they ask that all documents be sealed. Wells Fargo has put under provision of California law that everything be kept from public scrutiny, and Wells Fargo says this is simply a problem of computer technology, a bank employee who could have manipulated many accounts at one time. So they've locked up most of the information. The FBI is not going over the aircrafts that are owned by the people involved or looking for them, but they admit it is a huge problem, and I think, as I say, we're going to hear a lot about it for a long time. This is the end of the first 30 minutes. When I get back on the second half, I'm going into some more tentacles of how I think it reaches into the Reagan Gate and where I think this could lead if they try to find, if in fact the books show there are these missing millions. Did they come from Australia? Is this the CIA money that was brought there to bring that terrorism into California that Haig and Reagan are talking about? That's what I'm suspicious of. We'll take a break now and get back to that question for the second half hour.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay, now, the important thing historically about watching this case is that Senator Cranston recently, just 2 weeks ago, said terrorism is the biggest problem in the country. General Haig is talking about terrorism. The House Un-American Activities is coming together with terrorism. The control that Adolf Hitler had in Germany with the Reichstag fire that was set by his own people was create terror, it will bring police, and then the police can take you away and take away your life and liberty. They create, through provocateurs, the necessity for the police through violences of a kind, and then after they have the controls, then they take the very people that they said the police were there to protect. And I warned many times during the election of Carter and Ronald Reagan, and I certainly had a lot of things against Jimmy Carter, that Reagan's expertise, his shtick, was violence and getting people worked up. When he was the governor of California, that's when he wanted the mind control center to study the causes of violent behavior, and he knew that they would work on minorities and prisoners and blacks with electrodes and transponders and so forth, never accounting that poverty or lack of education, unemployment causes violence, or jealousy or frustration, being pushed into ghettos, overcrowded, overheated, hungry, drugged, drunk, causes violence. Violence comes from some racial thing in your brain that the government, the CIA, and the Pentagon, and the powers that be want psychosurgery on people's brains to see what part causes violence, particularly in minorities. And Reagan's whole establishment for 8 years, for people across the country, may not have studied things, but California was the home of things like the SLA, Jonestown, Edmund Kemper, Herbert Mullen, the Oda family murders, the Manson family. We have the Freeway Killer, the LA Stranglers, now the death of gays that we're talking about. And in San Francisco, the Muni bus drivers are being shot at random, and the beheadings at Golden Gate Park, and purposeful murders of people hiking at Mount Tamalpais, and used to be hitchhikers on the road were taken away. They still are, with the LA Freeway Strangler, who also had handcuffs and decal from the supervisors in LA and worked with the LAPD. So you get all of this violence in order to get a police state, and that takes money. And the question I'm asking is, when the bank emptied out in Australia, did it come to California? And did these guys, like Harold Smith, get on to the funneling of this money through these banks? And are they breaking open? Did they get a view of something, and they're being blamed for using too much of their own money and being too conspicuous? They broke into a bigger story, which Smith said they did. He said, we're minnows in a really big story. Now, the organization that was formed at Wells Fargo for fight promotion had the name of Muhammad Ali Sports Group in it. So Muhammad Ali gets several $100,000 a year. He was to get to use his name. The Los Angeles Times had an interview with Muhammad Ali this week. What do you think of Harold Smith? And they asked him what he thought about this, and his first remark is, the FBI is calling on me. Then he said, the CIA is guarding my house. So Muhammad Ali brings the CIA into this story. He said he got a phone call from Smith, who said, through Smith's friend, tell Ali I'm back in the country, and that this story makes Hollywood look small. When this is over, it will make a big movie. Some producers will say, we got a hell of a good script here. And then the phone rings, and Muhammad Ali answers and pretends it's the city morgue and says, is he dead? Because Smith is sure that he'll be killed before this story comes out. Then there's another phone call, and he says, yes, the White House. Hey, Ronald, how are you doing? And the article doesn't say whether Ronald Reagan actually did call him or whether he's clowning, but he was serious about the CIA guarding his house. And then Muhammad Ali says, I just can't figure out that one black man such as Harold Smith could have tricked the entire white establishment out of what they say. He got a call from Canada from a woman who said, is Smith a kook? And Muhammad Ali had a good answer. He said, we black folks don't use the word kook. You call him a kook before you know what's happening. Of course, you remember when Mark David Chapman shot John Lennon, we say he's a kook. When there's a fire, an arson where hundreds die, you say, oh, that's a kook. When we had Watergate and the men were caught at the hotel, they're kooks. The news media in America takes a major crime and puts it on one person with a smirk who has a funny look, or a man that killed Allard Lowenstein, and endless series of murders, and we call them kooks, and that's it. And Muhammad Ali, a little more sophisticated, said the black folks don't use the word, and you use it before you know what's happening. Another woman called him and wanted to know if his line was tapped. He said the FBI is interviewing you and me right now. There's a whole file in Washington on me, a whole department just to analyze me. It reminds me of the CIA trying to analyze Daniel Ellsberg at the time of the anti-war movement. And Muhammad Ali said 4 or 5 blocks away there's a rod aimed at my house, and everything I say, even in secret with my wife, is heard. The CIA is watching him night and day. Why would the CIA be so concerned unless this money actually was filed into the bank for the Central Intelligence Agency? And that's what Smith is hitting at, Harold Smith, and that it's a big, big story. Wait till it really comes out, and Muhammad Ali is waiting to hear. Now, as I say, the news media carries this. They're very cute about these things. It was just a little story, I think, a few weeks ago when I mentioned it to you. It was a tiny little story of some money that was missing, and then, as I say, it was the $20 million, and then $21 million, and then the Village Voice brought it into the Las Vegas casinos, which makes it a little more complicated with Paul Axel from Las Vegas, and the bribery and the scheming and the extortion and mail fraud, and the story gets a little bigger. And then, as I say, Harold Smith surfaced with $200 to $300 million, and then he goes on to, there's another article that Smith referred to, a Don King. He's a fighting promoter who is at the opposite end. He takes one of the team that fights, and Harold Smith takes the other. They were supposed to turn their men, Muhammad Ali, and Don King takes the other fighter, and they oppose each other, and both of the men, the boxing people, are kingpins in the boxing racket. But in this particular case, the New York Times has an article that the people who would be ahead if Don King was caught in indictments and boxing fraud and linked to organized crime would be Madison Square Garden owners, and they went on to say they're owned by Gulf and Western, and a man named Bob Arum and so forth would be the recipient if the boxing problem got tangled in organized crime and fraud and corruption and payoffs and so forth. There's another gang that are ready to take over the profits. The Holmes fight, the Muhammad Ali-Holmes fight, was at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, and they work with the owners of Caesar's Palace, who, according to the New York Times, were recently linked to Crime Figures. They asked for a license in Atlantic City and were linked to Crime Figures, and of course Frank Sinatra this week got his license with no mention of the Crime Figures that the New York Times is talking about. I think it was January 30th where the little article in the LA Times, Wells Fargo Bank talks about the embezzlement of several $1 million from an employee. It was an internal job, several million, and then at the bottom it says $20 million. And I thought that was a small article. I put it at the bottom of my pile, and we're talking about 80 or 40 or 200 million. That looked like a little article that week, but it did grow up into a much larger sum. And it's a question of who you believe now, whether you believe Harold Smith, who's head of the Muhammad Ali Professional Sports Group. It's called MAPS. Whether this thing is a big story, a bigger story, if he has the documents or not. Do you believe the Wells Fargo people that it's just a little story or a big story? There's some more stories in the New York Times on Harold Smith, the fellow that we're talking about, the main character, and I brought in a few quotations of those. He was little known. We'd only moved to Beverly Hills. He's 37 years old. When he got this large amount of money from the Wells Fargo Bank, he actually had never handled large amount of money before. He's been traveling around with $50,000, $30,000, and $100 bills, taking them up to Vegas. He owns a large home in Bel Air, California. He has 2 condominiums in Marina del Rey, $80,000 power boat, $40,000 El Dorado, another car, a Seville, a Mercedes. And the source of his financing has never been explained. He said a relative from Mississippi and his wife, and $6 million from Cox Communications for TV boxing. He's suspected, according to the New York Times, of drug traffic, and again, the drug trafficking comes into the Nugenhand Bank, the CIA bank that was closely linked to heroin traffic just a few months ago. He makes deposits into Wells Fargo that were explained by the New York Times were a cover for cocaine money, and he put a lot of drug money into the bank to establish his credit. Now, that may tell you how he got started at Wells Fargo, but it doesn't explain where he got these millions of dollars to put in the credit that he established there. And the inquiry into his background said that he has money from foreign sources and wealthy friends, and there's no suggestion about who the friends are. And also a New York Times story, inquiry into boxing promotion company threatens Madison Square Garden card. They have a fight coming up this February, next week or so, that was threatened. I want to go into the Madison Square Garden that Gene Harris, whose name is in the news a lot, who shot Dr. Tarnower, worked at Madison Square Garden for 2 years when she was going with Tarnower in the middle of their relationship, and then went down to the school in Maryland. But back to this money that Harold Smith is supposed to be responsible for. They said it came out of nowhere to promote fights. The Village Voice had an article. Well, if this money comes out of nowhere and it's linked to Las Vegas and it's linked to exposés of Wells Fargo Bank and mail frauds and every kind of criminal action, will these connections rub off on Paul Laxalt and Ronald Reagan and Caesar's Palace and Frank Sinatra and Westchester County? That is the Tarnower area where Reverend Moon and organized crime. There's sort of a suspicion on my part that the Beverly Hills, San Francisco linkage of the Wells Fargo banks and this tremendous amount of floating money that comes out of nowhere has to be explained before we know who's going to be hit the hardest by this, because nobody just comes up with all these millions of dollars with no explanation, and in the process of falling, he has so many connecting links to important people. Now, another article in the New York Times, until recently, Smith was a scuffler without any obvious source of important income. He worked organizing rock concerts, promoted rock concerts, met Muhammad Ali in 1960, but his career began with federal money given to Muhammad Ali in Pasadena in 1977. Federal money. Muhammad Ali is being guarded by the CIA and the FBI now, and the money for Harold Smith began, a man who allegedly worked in the civil rights movement in the South with Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael and organized petitions for Ali when he was had his title taken away during the war. And it had to do with a plastics manufacturer named Philip Fairchild in Pasadena, who had invited a certain person who was training for the Montreal Olympics to come to California and train for the Olympics, and Ali gave this person $30,000 for a home, and Harold Smith helped out. And Smith didn't have any money in 1970. He had asked to borrow some money from somebody, $300 in cash, in 1977. But through an introduction of federal funds in 1977, and in Pasadena, California, this is where Harold Smith met up with these people where all this money was floating. Now, in the book on Robert Vesco, it tells about his linkage from New Jersey to Pasadena, and of course Vesco, you have to read the books on the life of Vesco to appreciate how many areas and bases he touches, and Richard Nixon's bases in Pasadena, and Whittier and Ronald Reagan's. The money began, or the introductions began, through federal funds that introduced Harold Smith to Muhammad Ali and a plastic firm in Pasadena run by a Philip Fairchild. Now, Harold Smith made many trips to Australia, part of his biography in the New York Times, trips to Australia and to Hong Kong, and these are important. Hong Kong is coming out again in the Reagan story. There's some wonderful stories about Hong Kong. Maxine Cheshire, who writes such marvelous stories, Washington Post, that come out once a week, the VIP column, has an article about a man, Sir Y.K. Powell, who is the richest billionaire in Hong Kong, the shipbuilder, who's on the board of, he's the head president of Worldwide Marine Company, and an official in Chase Manhattan's advisory committee, Chase Manhattan Bank, International Advisory Committee. Ronald Reagan needed money for his inauguration ball, his inauguration committee, and this billionaire from Hong Kong put up $50,000 to Ronald Reagan's gala inauguration party. Now, Harold Smith's links go to occasional trips to Australia. Keep in mind, he didn't have anything in 77, and by 79, this money flowed in, and that's the year that the money was drained out of the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia of the CIA that involved narcotics. Smith made occasional trips to Australia, and then his dealings were through Hong Kong. He's suspected of laundering drug money in a Hong Kong bank. And of course, as I say, the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia was emptied out that involved drug money and the CIA. And the counterintelligence, the violence or the terrorism that makes Haig or the House Un-American Activity or Reagan proclaim this kind of activity that we have to watch in this country, that takes a lot of money to get activity going on the streets. Remember at the time of Watergate, when the men were arrested, and it turned out that people in Miami had $100 bills in their pockets that Bernard Barker and Martinez were handing out to pay for violent demonstrations against the anti-war people and George McGovern, and they even paid so-called hippies, nude women, to discredit the hippies and the anti-war people, and they had $100 bills to kidnap political left and take them to Mexico and to run bordellos and get congressmen compromised. That took a lot of CIA money, and the breaking of the Watergate story stopped the kind of violence that took place in Chicago in 1968. And the only reason it was quiet in Miami in 1972 was because the Watergate story broke in June. And by August, the hundreds of dollars of CIA money that was floating around for the disruptions was linked again to the banks through Texas and Houston and Gulf and Western, and to the committee to re-elect the president. So I suspect that the Nugan Hand money could have been emptied out of Australia and linked, combined with narcotics in Hong Kong and Ronald Reagan and this political group that are in now, to get ready for what I've predicted for a long time would be a new series of violences in Bay Area and California as soon as Reagan was president. Going back last November 1980, tape 465, I talked about the people that had been murdered in relationship to the Nugan Hand Bank, and earlier I did tapes on the Nugan Hand burglary. But this Smith makes trips to Australia frequently and to Hong Kong, and again, that has the same linkage or links to an area where a lot of CIA money is missing and was used for counterintelligence before and could be used again. Now, in the Muhammad Ali Sports Group was formed at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium in 1979 in May. They had a fight in 1979, May 25th. And at that time, Smith lost a lot of money. He didn't make any money at the box office. He lost more than $1.5 million in the fight. And this particular promoter that was giving money to boxers and getting them to sign up with him, the first fights that he arranged, and he was fairly new at this, he was losing many, many million and spending a lot of million on himself. So there was a lot of millions of dollars floating around unaccounted for, and I think that a lot of the answer of this money will come to Australia and Hong Kong and back to Reagan and the Vegas gang and Caesar's Palace. And I hope I'm not making this too complicated for you, but I want to spend the entire hour this evening so that as stories break on this, you can save articles in your papers around the country and see what you're picking up. Now, Harold Smith said last week that he had hired Paul Caruso, as I said before, the noted California attorney, to represent him. And if any of you have the book on the Manson family, Helter Skelter, you'll read there how Lawrence Schiller, a self-described journalist, went with Paul Caruso and Richard Cavallaro and asked the journalist, would you be interested in selling the story of Suzanne Atkins of the Manson family? And it was Paul Caruso and his associate Caballero, who began selling stories. And Smith says what a movie this would make, what a story it would make. And he has hired the same Paul Caruso to represent him, the man who broke the Sue Atkins story to the European Press Syndicate, according to Bugliosi, and had the story going out about the Manson family. Again, the Manson family, if you read Bugliosi's book, and the same thing happened with the SLA, they disguised themselves as black and left the credit cards of the murdered Biancas in the black part of town so that they would think black people did the murders, and wrote "Death to the Pig" on the door with blood so they would think it was the Black Panthers. And this same neo-Nazi counterintelligence group wanted people to be afraid of the blacks, and the SLA were painting their faces black so that the crimes would look, the kidnapping, as if they were black when they were white. The shooting of Dr. Marcus Foster in Oakland that preceded Patty Hearst's kidnapping by 3 weeks. Well, how far will this story grow in the next weeks, in the next months? Will it be stopped? I don't know. The New York Times had another story on the FBI, and this is what they said. The FBI is extending their investigation beyond boxing figures into other organizations, but it doesn't say what organizations. It said it will probably lead to incriminating organized crime figures in the non-boxing enterprise, but it doesn't say who in the non-boxing enterprise it could lead to. There's any number of possibilities. Abscam started out with endless possibilities and then was closed because certain people in the FBI gave leaks which forced them to stop investigating and prosecuting, and maybe someone from the inside will do the same thing here. Now, some of these people, as I said, are involved with Bob Arum, the head of a group called Top Rank, a graduate of law school, and a John Condon, C-O-N-D-O-N, who's the president of boxing for Madison Square Garden, the subsidiary of Gulf and Western. And there are a lot of questions about the Madison Square Garden connections, the boxing figures, and so forth. And just last week there was a social affair. Again, Maxine Cheshire wrote in VIP. She has these marvelous articles. This is the Washington Post, February the 8th. Ronald Reagan's old days. This was about his birthday party and his swimming. And it said, one of the things that his agent, former agent, one-time agent, Sonny Werblin, likes to kid the president about when they get together with their early swimming fishing days. Werblin, the former New York Jets owner who was chairman of Madison Square Garden Corporation, was one of the guests at the president's birthday party Friday night. So while all of this was coming down and involving Madison Square Garden and a lot of persons that rent the space for fighting, Ronald Reagan's, one of the first people that was with him and befriended him, is now the manager of Madison Square Garden. The Village Voice, Jack Newfield, had an article how Dan Rather did an expose on CBS about the links of ABC to this scandal, and that Dan Rather accumulated 327 pages and reports and affidavits and tapes and documentary evidence of suggested illegal acts. Now, if I were looking for a smoking gun, knowing Dan Rather's role in Dallas at the time of the Kennedy assassination, and his links to the Eastern establishment, he's soon to take over Cronkite's seat with the news, Dan Rather holds a lot of the future questions or the direction of this way it's going to go. I could see Dan Rather as press secretary to George Bush if Ronald Reagan were linked or smeared to what could get off as a Reagan gate if it opens up. I see the tentacles here. That Wells Fargo bank in Beverly Hills is just 2 blocks from his barber, Drecker's Barber, and it's a hangout of all the Ronald Reagan cronies in Beverly Hills, and if it stretches to so many branch banks and so much money and up and down the coast, and the missing other CIA money that isn't accounted for, and Mr. Smith's frequent trips to Australia and then to Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong billionaire with Ronald Reagan, and the Caesars Palace with Peter Pitchess of the old Manson gang testifying for Frank Sinatra. I think you all would agree that well, I'm throwing around a lot of names tonight. There's an interesting web of circumstances to consider the possibilities. And as I say, when you bring in the Eastern establishment of Dan Rather, it really gets interesting. The Los Angeles Times started this thing back on the sports pages. The San Francisco Chronicle has practically nothing, even though they mention the San Francisco Wells Fargo Bank. The New York Times is eating it up. The Washington Post has just a little teeny thing, you know, they don't really want to touch it. But the New York Times and the Eastern establishment, the kind that would not want Ronald Reagan in very much longer, but would really love their Yale guy, George Bush, in the White House, they seem to be relishing it with pages and pages of material from the New York Times and Village Voice articles. And that's why I think that bringing in Dan Rather and suggesting that he has pages on this information almost sounds like he can either hold it back or keep leaking it out, but we don't know what he knows. The media coverage I'll continue to watch is as interesting as the story itself. In the meanwhile, the Madison Square Garden is returning money for the fights that are supposed to be scheduled, and Harold Smith is talking about the plans to kill him. Don King, the sports promoter, said that 2 years ago, Harold Smith said he had a terminal illness, and in 2 years, meaning now, maybe he knew he would be dead of lead poisoning. He means, of course, lead through the bullet. Smith says that they're trying to kill me, and he's called in several times how his life is in danger and that he'll be dead in 2 days if he doesn't reveal some of the documents that he has, and he's put them in a safe place. And with Paul Caruso as his attorney, I think it can develop into a good story. Well, I did want to spend, as I say, the whole evening. I'll get back to other stories next week, but I think this has the tentacles of a Reagan gate, and a lot of unanswered questions from the past could be answered here, and maybe what Johnny Meyer has to say when he writes his 10 or 20 or 30 pages that we can get of the transactions that went on that he knew about working for the CIA and the Hughes organization 10 years. Maybe some of those pieces will fit in. In the meantime, I'm following a lot of other stories, but I'm watching this in particular, and we'll just see where it goes in the weeks to come. In the meanwhile, this is Mae Brussel in Carmel, California, and I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussel. This program originates from Carmel, California.